Turn the clock back, and 10 years ago, this August, the FMMA held its first meeting at the historic Skirvin Hotel. Jake Hempton and his team, Megan Friedman in particular, knew how to put a meeting together, having done this many years for their banking clients. A few of you in the room now were in the room then. My recollection is that, just as Jay said, if we had 50 people or less come, we would disband. If 50 to 75 showed up, the association would live another year. We had 110 attendees and also, as Jay mentioned, a stern warning from the fire marshal. Everyone we asked to speak agreed to speak, a key to our successful launch. The room was electric, as we had hoped, with buyers and sellers interacting directly in the way that so many in the cartel dread. There were some pretenders in the room. At that first meeting, opportunists, it turns out, who, while waving the free market flag that day, soon went home to their troll mamas, back to their old ways. The membership has realized steady growth for 10 years because of, not in spite of, our pillars and principles. All who join us must walk the gauntlet of the pillars, as you know. Let's review them briefly. First, price is not a product, and selling access to pricing is prohibited. Second, value is established when the buyer and the seller agree to a fully disclosed, mutually beneficial price for the care rendered. Third, any willing buyer should be offered the same price available to everyone else. Are there vendors or sellers who are not in this room who would like to be with us but have failed this test? You better believe it. If we bent the standards the pillars represent, would this organization be larger? Probably. However, this organization has never been a fan of bigger is better. We prefer better is better. This enormous gathering is a manifestation of the fact that better, not bigger's time has arrived, and demonstrates the faith that buyers, sellers, and intermediaries can work together without robbing and abusing each other. From what wellspring does this faith flow? Why are the individuals in this group so obsessed with right and wrong, even to the extent that it diminishes their profitability? Last year, I spoke about why we should focus on individual buyers, not groups of buyers, as this approach held more promise for our rebellion. Our mission is to craft and manage an alternative, not reform the mainstream industry's cesspool. As our DPC friends have recently quipped with regard to the government's latest version of healthcare reform, if this is change, you can keep the change. This year, rather than talk about this movement or organization, I'd like to talk about you and me as individuals, and how we should view our role now and in the future. We must give consideration to why right and wrong matter in general, and in order to ensure that we do not repeat the mistakes that our predecessors, most of whom now play for the other team. I believe this very personal discussion is foundational for a new and better future. My father once told me not to worry too much about someone whose life philosophy was different from mine. The worrisome individual is someone who has no philosophy whatsoever. The great Joe Sobran once quipped that the problem with Bill Clinton was not that he was immoral, the problem was that he was amoral. To not know the difference between right and wrong is the mark of a child. To know the difference and not care is the mark of a psychopath. While I believe many in our industry do not care to right wrongs, there are an increasing number whose consciences are moving them to act. Their first action, a self-preserving move, is often apostasy. That is, renouncing their previously held belief or position. As many of you in this room know all too well, formal renunciation of the industry mainstream is not without real risk. Those who would fault me for applying the concept of apostasy, usually reserved for religious conversions, to the medical mainstream underestimate the fact that for many godless public health stormtroopers, the medical mainstream is their religion. Mainstream medical apostasy is indeed a courageous move, but it is a first step. The next step, one many of you have taken, is true leadership. We could just say that leadership is action, not words, but there's more to it, isn't there? For the next few minutes, I'd like to share a lens that I've found helpful and one through which you can better see yourself as an actor in this free market cause. I'll draw heavily for what follows from a small but powerful book by Eric Lavrentz. Eric is the pastor at the First Presbyterian Church in Edmond, just north of here. And while this book reflects the Christian faith he and I share, the book simultaneously retains a secular appeal. Famous theological apologists who have reached across the secular aisle, as Eric has done, include Aquinas, Anselm of Canterbury, Mortimer Adler, Hugo Grotius, C.S. Lewis, and many others. To understand leadership, Eric suggests we envision people as a member of one of four groups. The good citizen, this is someone who lives decently and well, doesn't rock the boat, and works to maintain the status quo. They are the backbone of a stable community. The managerial elite, these are the folks who are in charge of the environments where good citizens are encouraged to work together: schools, churches, universities, corporations. Good citizens hope to someday advance to the level of the managerial elite, but never with the intent of disturbing the status quo or rocking the boat. Neither good citizens nor the managerial elite live differently from the people around them. The managerial elite are commonly mistaken for leaders. In a perfect society, all we need are good citizens and their managerial elite. Leadership's only required when a change in the status quo is required, only when the boat needs rocking, as in times of crisis. The third group Eric calls Pharisees. Pharisees, as many of you recall, focused on their own purity, lived differently and aloof from the masses, and had no interest in impacting anyone around them. They considered the world a lost cause. Not linked by covenant to anyone, they were always in competition with their neighbors and therefore lived at odds with the entire world. This adversarial view of others and the world is the genesis of zero-sum thinking and the economics of conquest, where one can only advance at the expense of another. Contrast this with the peaceful and cooperative, mutually beneficial exchange we all promote. Those who bitterly and ceaselessly complain but take no action, while holding themselves up as an example, are current-day Pharisees, and we all know some. The cowardice preventing action by them usually comes from some past failure they cannot overcome. Pharisees are apostates, formally renouncing all around them, but unwilling to act for change. Let's review the characteristics of a Pharisee. They're apostates, they're aloof, critical of the masses, given up on the world, in competition with and at odds with their neighbors in the world. They are rules-focused, and they actually seek rejection of the masses, whereas a leader is in covenant with them. Last but not least are the true leaders. To move beyond the first three categories, one must live differently and seek to impact others with your life. Bucking the status quo distinguishes a leader from a member of the managerial elite. Further, concerning oneself with the fate of others distinguishes a true leader from a Pharisee. This slide provides an excellent visual for review of what I just described. The good citizen, managerial elite at the bottom, they have no desire to live differently. The Pharisee and the leader at the top, the Pharisee lives differently, but has no interest in impacting others. Dr. Lavrence argues that in order to assume the leader's seat, one must grapple with 4 basic questions. What sustains me? What makes me significant? Of what am I certain, and am I willing to be rejected? I would argue that if you are not intimately familiar with rejection, you've never truly sat in a leadership role. Rejection is actually a hallmark of leadership, as it is a natural occurrence when the boat gets rocked. Many, if not all of you in this room, are familiar with rejection by the mainstream. If the medical mainstream hasn't rejected you, you've likely not attempted to rock the boat in a meaningful way. Remember that as a true leader, you must not only question the mainstream with your words, but also your actions. I like to think of rejection by our industry's mainstream as a badge of honor. To help keep our balance while under attack, one must ponder the first 3 questions, as the answers will help us persevere. What sustains me? What makes me significant? And of what am I certain? Examining leadership through this lens, a view which forces us to closely examine who we are at our core, brings this year's conference theme into stark relief. After all, Back to the Future theme suggests that we used to be better than we are now. It suggests that something has gone wrong. The theme also suggests that the future bodes well for those of us who attempt to imitate more of who we used to be. How far back in time we should go is irrelevant if we commit the same errors as our predecessors, isn't it? We'll end up right back where we are, or worse. Going forward, we must meet the inevitable rejection we will all face with confidence and be more resolute than those who have gone before. Rocking boats will test one's mettle, and surviving is impossible if you don't know who you are and why right and wrong matters to you. Conforming to and consorting with the mainstream signals a lack of will that stems from a failure to address the first 3 questions, with which we must grapple, and therefore a desire to garner accolades, not rejection from the trolls. In short, what sustains us, what makes us significant, and of what are we certain as individuals is precisely what sustains this movement. Before I go any further, let's examine just a few examples of leaders and the rejection they've encountered. I'll stick to the medical profession, but we could list many theologians, scientists, economists, philosophers, novelists, journalists, historians, and even musicians who have lost their careers or their lives adhering to their firm principles. In many cases, leaders never know that many years after their death, fruit is born from the rejection they withstood. Let's start with William Buchan, an 18th century Scottish physician, to show that the persecution and rejection of those who defy the mainstream is nothing new. In 1769, Dr. Buchan, a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians, published Domestic Medicine. This scandalous book, whose subtitle, A Treatise on the Prevention and Cure of Diseases, was meant for the layman, and that was the source of the scandal. He explains in the introduction that the book was written not to supersede the use of a physician, but to supply his place in situations where medical assistance could not be easily obtained. Dr. Buchan was forced to reconsider the notion that every physician wished to conceal his art. He lamented that the persecution he endured over this book was no doubt due to educating patients many of his colleagues preferred sick or dead. Dr. Buchan was warned of the ill treatment he'd likely receive from his colleagues for his apostasy, but this dissuasion appears to have energized his commitment and leadership. There were 19 editions of Domestic Medicine and translations in at least a dozen languages. The preface to the 1789 edition, which I'm proud to own, is almost painful to read as he relays his disenchantment with his own profession. Physicians have historically tortured apostates and have more severely brutalized leaders who challenge the mainstream. Dr. Buchanan's story highlights how open-sourced we are in this movement. I've met no one in this association that is not collegial and willing to share all the tips they've gleaned along the way. You dog-eat-dog free market capitalists are supposed to claim that all you know is proprietary, right? Or is a lack of cooperation, a desire to conceal your art, a hallmark of the cartel? Dr. Buchanan was no Pharisee. He was in covenant with his fellow man and at odds with his mainstream colleagues. Let's move to Oliver Wendell Holmes, apostate and leader for sure. He championed the stethoscope and coined the term anesthesia in a letter to William Morton, the first to publicly demonstrate ether. From Wikipedia. Oh, it's Wikipedia. He often criticized traditional medical practices and once quipped that if all contemporary medicine was tossed into the sea, it would be all the better for mankind and all the worse for the fishes. He sounds like he was our kind of guy, daring to be rejected. Holmes proposed that the fever of childbirth, which killed up to half of women at the time, was largely due to physicians attending these births with unwashed hands fresh from an autopsy. He came under attack by two distinguished professors of obstetrics, Dr. Hugh Lodge and Charles Meigs, who adamantly denied his theory of contagion. In 1855, Holmes doubled down and published a revised version of this essay under the new title, Maternal Fever as a Private Pestilence. In a new introduction in which he directly addressed his opponents, he wrote, "I had rather rescue one mother from being poisoned by their physician than claim to have saved 40 out of 50 patients to whom I had carried the disease." A few years later, Ignaz Semmelweis would reach similar conclusions in Vienna, Austria, where his introduction of hand washing in chlorine solution before assisting delivery would considerably lower the maternal mortality rate. His work, while very controversial at the time, is now considered a landmark of the germ theory of disease. Semmelweis suffered much more vicious attacks than Holmes, as his conclusions, like those of Holmes, pointed the finger at the doctors entrusted by the patients they were killing. Semmelweis did not live to witness the fruits of his leadership. Despite his research, Semmelweis's observations conflicted with the established scientific and medical opinions of the time, and his ideas were rejected by the medical community. Doctors were offended at the suggestion that they should wash their hands, and they mocked him for it. In 1865, the increasingly outspoken Semmelweis allegedly suffered a nervous breakdown and was committed to an asylum by his colleagues. In the asylum, he was beaten by the guards, and he died 2 weeks later from a gangrenous wound on his hand, a result of the beating. His findings earned widespread acceptance only years after his death, when Louis Pasteur confirmed the germ theory, giving Semmelweis's observations a theoretical explanation. Joseph Lister, acting on Pasteur's research, practiced and operated using these hygienic methods with great success. Dr. Buchanan, Holmes, and Semmelweis knew of what they were certain. Sparing suffering and the lives of others made them significant. This allowed them to lean into the rejection they encountered. Information moves so much more quickly now and we are therefore far more likely to see the fruits of our leadership efforts here. Fortunately, attempts to stifle misinformation by government have proven to be far less effective than the tyrants had hoped. I couldn't help but think about the COVID apostates and leaders after reading Eric Laverence's 4 basic questions. Much of what we now know about COVID came from outspoken leaders, many of whom are members of this association who were shamed, canceled, and vilified only to be subsequently vindicated. They were willing to face rejection, and face it, they did. In order to lead, in order to get back to the future, in order to avoid the mistakes of the past, we must therefore self-examine and courageously address our own individual inconsistencies and failings. Focusing on all that is wrong with others will not help our progress. We'll end up right back where we are now. Are there any signs that we are succeeding? How about this? The president of the Texas Hospital Association, in a recent speech meant to inspire his membership, said this: "We need to recapture the narrative." When do they think they lost it? And who is responsible? To whom does this narrative belong right now? It's ours. Rather than gloat, we must continually remind ourselves of the principles and mission that delivered us from this beast. We must know the answers to the first 3 questions. I would add that as leaders who would get back to the future and roll back the clock, we should consider our relationship with the state in order to avoid the mistakes of the past. What is your relationship with the state? Is it cozy? Is it trusting? The errors of the past have occurred when an otherwise free market invited government to the party. There are 2 types of state huggers in our industry. The first type has bribed their way to the government trough, plugging into the money machine, all the while claiming that this was meant to benefit the communities they were robbing. In woke speak, they identify as trolls. The second type is the well-intentioned individual in the industry, impatient to see their own vision blossom. They support state mandates initially, only later to discover their vision has been watered down or destroyed altogether. Rather than allow the natural progression of the market, flirtation with the state in an attempt to fast-forward results has corrupted this industry and derailed the plans of visionaries. Involving the state in our movement is a risk that should be acknowledged and be seen as the kiss of death history has shown it to be. Here are some examples of government to the rescue. The Flexner Report, Wage and Price Controls, Hill-Burton Act, Medicare, HMO Act, Resource-Based Relative Value Scale, HIPAA, Unaffordable Care Act. We could go on. Whenever flirting with the state to help your cause teases you, remember author John Barry's quote, "Politics plus science equals politics." Whatever deal you think you've made, it's not your deal. It's their deal. I remind anyone who presents their grand government-controlled scheme to me that we must first discuss the force and violence required for its implementation prior to discussing their actual plan. Government is, after all, that outfit whose ideas are so wonderful that they must be mandatory. The market is the peaceful way to exchange goods and services, and if we could turn the clock back and pursue a path free of government, we would find ourselves now in a better place, one that looks much more like the vision all in this room share. First-class, affordable care. In our industry, mutual beneficial exchange, and government mandates are incompatible. As leaders, we can be at peace with our neighbor, or like Pharisees, be at war with the world. To conclude, let's examine a modified live differently, impact others diagram. The good citizen hopes to step into the managerial elite box at some point, although anywhere along the way, he can rock the boat and step into the apostate or the Pharisees box. A member of the managerial elite can also start asking inconvenient questions and find themselves in the role of the apostate, having renounced their prior beliefs and stepped into the Pharisees box. It is only when they then want to cooperate with their fellow man at the risk of material and social rejection that they step back into the leader's box. No longer living at odds with their fellow man as a Pharisee, they move to the world of mutual benefit and all the miracles that entails. I hope you can all see that this free market we all champion, this market discipline we all obey, the golden rule, it must be embraced in order to truly transition to the leader's role and assume a partner's relationship with patients and their proxy buyers. The Free Market Medical Association has the golden rule and your individual stamp all over it. This organization is what it is, and in the future will be what it will be because of who we are as individuals. If we carefully examine who we are, courageously embrace our leadership role, and shun the state's siren song, I believe our rebellion has a bright future. The view of leadership I've presented has been helpful to me, and I hope will be helpful to you. Paradoxically, a look at ourselves in the mirror will provide us a clear-cut path to the future we all envision. Thank you.